Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time here, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, how's it going? See what happens when you subscribe? You get a bonus greeting on every episode. On this episode, we talked to Noreen. She's a chief compliance officer, a fellow oldest child, which I love. And she talks about how to really be a better compliance officer. You know, so many times we live in the black and white. So many times we come in contact with people that maybe have had a bad experience with ethics and compliance in the past. And she really has a great energy, a great framework, and a great attitude about how to really be not just a compliance officer, but be a better partner to the business and really drive towards solutions. So I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. And if you don't, you should. All right. See you next time.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
All right, Noreen, welcome to the Ethics Experts. This is our little bit of hiccups this morning, but I'm so glad to finally get you on and appreciate your patience.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what you were like as a kid. We both, I think, suffer from oldest child syndrome, but how did that sort of show up in your life?
I think being the oldest of two, I have a sister who's 2 years younger than I am and very, very different personality. I was always the rule follower growing up. I was always my parents would say to me, "You're older, you should know better." And I always was asked to kind of lead by example, I think. My sister would say I was the boring one. I think she would to this day probably say that. But for me, I never necessarily saw myself coming into a compliance role, but I think following rules and understanding the guardrails and has always been a comfort zone for me. So I'm kind of not surprised I ended up here. I don't know that I would have intentionally thought that's where I would have ended up, but it feels good. I like the role that I'm in very much.
You know, what is it about parents that they like forget? I don't know, like they like learn on the oldest, you know?
Yes,
and
no
it
doubt.
seemed, you know, the rules
no
that I
doubt.
had were way different than the rules that like my brother and my sisters had. And I mean, what do you think that is? That they just are like, oh, I guess all those things that, you know, this one turned out all right. I guess we can like lighten it up a little bit.
I think that's exactly it, Nick. I really do think they are overly cautious with the first one because it's kind of their first rodeo and they want to make sure they don't misstep. But I think they hold us, at least in my household, I was always held to a higher standard. Always. It was a different standard. My sister got away with way more than I ever did. And so I don't know. I think it was just the expectations were pretty high for me as the older child. There's no doubt.
Yeah. You know, almost, you know, the oldest are kind of, we're boring by design, you know?
Yeah. We could coin that phrase. I love that. Yes. There you go.
I like it. That could be a book title. You know, maybe that's our episode title.
I think that's right.
So you went kind of down the legal path and you got involved with an in-house program kind of right after 9/11. And I think you were saying that it was kind of to regulate these broker dealers, which were a kind of a mechanism for terrorists to get funded. How did that kind of work? How were they utilizing, you know, broker dealers to fund their activities sort of prior to this regulation being imposed?
So, you know, it's interesting. Banks were already subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, which requires banks to surveil for suspicious activity and look for anomalous activity in regular banking accounts. Brokerage accounts were not at that time subject to the same requirements. And so you could open a brokerage account. You were not being surveilled for suspicious activity or anomalous activity. And at the time, terrorists figured out that that was kind of a gap in our banking surveillance compliance world. And a lot of the brokerage accounts, they were used by the terrorists at the time to deposit money that was coming from whoever was behind the 9/11 attacks and being able to take money out with really not raising any red flags or questions. And so our legislature pretty quickly figured that out and required brokerage houses to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act requirements, which banks had already been subject to. And so a lot of brokerage houses had to hire people who understood how to do this or could spearhead the effort. I was fortunate to be given that opportunity, and I went in and I was sitting in a legal role, but I had to work very closely with the compliance team and it allowed me an insight into how important understanding the operations of a firm are, the technology of a firm, what's possible, what's going to be a challenge. And so it was my first in-house role, and I've kind of never really looked back. I've stayed pretty much in the in-house track.
What was it like at that time? I mean, did you feel like you were kind of, I don't know. I mean, I just remember when 9/11 happened, it was like, we all kind of, the whole country kind of came together, and there was sort of
Yes.
this purpose kind of behind all of these sort of ancillary things. What was the environment like at that time, and how did that event kind of animate what was being done inside the organization?
I think the point around we were all on a mission to fix this and to hopefully ensure it could never happen again made the collective internal partnership solid. There was
Yeah.
no, we don't have time for this. Why are we doing this? There was no competition for resources around how are we going to prioritize this. Everyone, I think, philosophically was all in on the import of what we were doing and why we needed to do it. And so, that's not always the case when you're trying to build out a new program at a
Yeah, right.
company that's got a gazillion things on their to-do list. But in this case, because of, I think, the genesis of why brokerage houses were being brought into the fold, there was kind of an all hands on deck, which made it an easier exercise. There was still, quite candidly, because, I'm New Jersey based. And so this, 9/11 obviously hit very
Right.
close to home. And, there was a lot of emotion and still a lot of people reeling from the aftermath of 9/11. And so it brought us together, even internally, to kind of just get this done. I think people really believed in why this was so important.
Was this, this might be kind of a stupid question, but was this kind of like a known gap? Was this like a dirty little secret in the space, or was this really not really on most people's radar?
I don't think it was on the radar. I really don't. I think it's unfortunate that the investigations that occurred immediately after 9/11 on how this happened revealed that this was a gap in our controls in the financial services industry. And to the credit of our legislature at the time, they passed the USA Patriot Act, which is really what extended the Bank Secrecy Act to broker dealers. And, all the broker dealers jumped in and understood this was something that needed this gap had to be closed pretty quickly.
So it's kind of a nice, not nice, but you know what I mean? It was kind of like a nice way to sort of start getting involved with compliance because, as you said, it was that's sort of an atypical kind of an environment, right? Where everybody's like, hey, yeah, absolutely, I have time for you. Yes, absolutely, we all need to do this. There's sort of that, like you said, that singularity of purpose, that all hands on deck kind of energy. How did that, you've been in now this space for a while. How did that help, or did that sort of thing help, do you think, in retrospect, like solidify your attraction to this space? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like the first one's free
did.
kind of a thing.
Yes, it absolutely
it's like, oh, okay,
did.
this is kind of easy. We're putting some rules in place. There's some actual compliance with this stuff. I'm not pushing, a string up a hill here.
Yeah, it absolutely did. What I think for me was kind of the turning point of what made me realize I really liked kind of the compliance angle was you can't implement a rule if you don't understand how business operations work.
Yeah.
And I think when you sit in a true legal role and you're opining and giving advice, which is so important in any company, you often hand off that advice to people who have to know how the operations work. But when you're in compliance, you bridge that gap. You have to understand what the regulations require, but then you also, in order to be an effective compliance professional, you have to understand how the operations work, and you have to understand where the challenges are going to be, and you have to really dig in a little more deeply on business operations. And I realized going through this exercise that I love that aspect of learning about it. It allowed me to meet many more people across the organization in cross-functional roles and solidify relationships. And I just really enjoyed that aspect of the rollout and made me realize that there was an aspect of compliance that maybe this was a direction I could take my career. Like I absolutely loved the bringing together of the business operations with the regulatory and legal advice that I was giving.
Yeah, it's like these regulations are written sort of in a lab somewhere or in some kind of an ivory tower, and it's like bringing that down to earth and putting that actually into practice is many times like easier said than done. To your point, like you have to like sort of graft these new sort of controls into an existing body in some ways. I think that is it's weird that we're talking about this at some level because that seems to be like the biggest gap in compliance even today. Like when you look at really successful programs and you compare those to like less successful programs, ones that are, maybe like less effective or less impactful, it really usually in my experience kind of boils down to that kind of gap, whether it's something that's just sort of stapled onto, it's kind of stapled onto the business versus kind of like actually permeating the business. What do you think is at the core of that? Do you think it's like a mindset thing by the people who are trying to do it? Do you think it's sometimes too overwhelming to try to understand? I get in my car every day and I don't even know how the engine of it works. So like I have some empathy for that, but like, what do you think is at the core of that pervasive gap that still, 20 years later, we're still kind of dealing with at some
I
level?
do think it is somewhat a mindset issue. And I think it also could be due to the culture of an organization, right? I mean,
Okay.
some of the best advice I've received in my career came from a prior leader that I had who said to me, Noreen, the best compliance professionals have to know the business processes better than their business partners. And
Right.
that was kind of setting the expectation of how he expected his compliance team to operate within the organization, right? Dig in, understand what the operations are. To your point, Nick, understand where the challenges are going to be. But I also have colleagues who have left organizations because compliance is no more than a paper program. It's not
Mm-hmm.
operationalized. It's not practical. And I just don't think you can have an effective compliance program if it's not practical. And so my challenge to my team is always, does this work for the business? Find out, meet with them, walk them through what we need to do, and then ask them to help us solution how we're going to do it based on the business processes, based on what the limitations are going to be. And if we can work around those limitations, great. If they have to be addressed, let's have a plan for that. But don't just roll something out and not sit with them and walk them through it and get them in voice so that we come up with a collective solution that actually works for the company. Otherwise, the time you take to write out a compliance program, if it's not practical and can't be operationalized, it's not worth anybody's time. And that's
Yeah.
almost worse than not having one.
Yeah, it is worse. And I mean, there's just so much like potential waste in not doing what you're talking about. There's a waste of time. There's the false sense of security that comes from saying like, oh, well, we have a document, we have a policy. No one's even freaking read it. No one's even like
Right.
looking at it, let alone like following
Right.
it. How do how do you train your team, or like, how do you, before we talk about teams, like, how do you maintain that focus? Is that just like a first principle for you?
Yes.
And how do you prevent yourself from falling into that trap that sometimes we fall into as we gain more experience to say like, oh, I've seen it all before. And it's like, well, no one's seen it all before. How do you
I ask
keep
a
that
ton
sort
of
of beginner
questions.
eye? Yeah.
I ask a ton of questions. I think it drives my team and my business partners crazy sometimes, but I don't mind being the one that's like, walk me through this. I'm not really sure I'm understanding how it works, or can you take me down a level so I have more information, because here's my impression. I'm not sure that's accurate. And so what I try to do, Nick, is role model my own continued curiosity. On a personal and professional level, even at this point in my career journey, I am the best when I'm feeling challenged and engaged. And I'm not at a point, nor do I think I'm hardwired to ever be one of those people that just wants to phone it in, because I'm at a point in my career journey where maybe I'm not in the trenches every day and having to do the heavy lifting, but I better be darn sure that I know how the heavy lifting is getting done and can guide my team and support them. But I role model that with my business partners. When my team is present, when they're not present, I ask a ton of questions. Walk me through this. I'm not sure I understand. I don't mind being the one that doesn't have all the answers. I feel like sometimes the best outcomes come when you ask questions and you're either getting clarity, but more importantly, you ensure for your business partners, they believe when you ask those questions, you really want to understand what they do and what their challenges are. And that solidifies the relationship, quite frankly.
Have you always been that way? I'm asking like, there was a point in time when I was in school where was like insecure to raise my hand and ask a question. And my dad was like, that's your time to like learn whatever's being taught. And, you kind of have the right to ask that question. So I started, sitting in the front of the class. And if I didn't get something, I just was like, screw it, I'm going to just ask the question. And then I would later kind of find out. And these all kind of reinforced this. You like how I ask you a question and then give you my story? It kind of reinforced this where people would say, oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. I didn't understand that either. And that kind of gave me more confidence to ask those questions. And now I'm kind of like you. I want to understand how something works and I don't mind looking dumb. Can you remember a point? Like, have you always been that way, just naturally curious? Or can you remember a point where you kind of flip the switch on this muscle that I think a lot of us maybe haven't switched on yet, or we still feel kind of silly about because it's maybe something that we should understand given our position, or you know what I'm saying? Like there's some insecurity that is like some headwind that causes folks to not ask questions, to really truly seek to understand when, if they did understand it, might lead to a better outcome.
To answer your question, yes, I've always been innately curious. I don't know that I've always been the front row student, but maybe third row like that. But I've always been raising my hand. I always had, I think, an innate level of confidence to not care if others in the room thought I was asking too many questions and so I kind of feel like in order to get there, you have to have some level of just self-confidence to weather kind of how people may view that. But I feel, especially in a professional environment, it doesn't do anybody any favors if you're just going to walk out of a room. First of all, nobody's got the time to circle back 6 times to get clarity that you could have had you been willing to take the time during that one meeting, get the clarity needed. And I often realize that by opening the door to ask questions, it starts other people getting comfortable asking questions, and it ends up being a much more productive overall use of everyone's time. So someone's always got to be the first, right? So if it's me, that's great. If it's others, I usually tack on if I have my own questions. And I've never kind of been afraid to be that person, I think.
You know what? I'm just going to only hire firstborns going forward. I'm only kind of kidding. Yeah, but it does set an example. It does set an example around you. And then when you can model that kind of behavior, then, I think it helps other people to kind of come out of their shell a little bit. And I remember when I first got this job, I was so concerned with like the board thinking that I wasn't an idiot. This might be a little therapy session here, but I was so concerned, I really wanted them to think that I was smart and make them, I really wanted them to believe that they made a good bet on us, me and my brother, run this company. And over time, I've realized that they weren't really questioning that. They were really kind of focused on the results. And I've been trying to coach other folks that join our organization or who are maybe doing something, I consistently see this overcompensation for somebody not knowing the answer to something. And I think it's rooted in that desire for their audience or their boss, whatever, to think that they're smart. And I think it ends up creating like a lot of ineffectiveness at the end of the day. It's like, I think if you have a position, you've earned that position, right? Like you presumably went through a hiring process and you won that out. People are not constantly, second guessing that. I think they're really kind of more focused on the results. And I think when we can internalize that, it then becomes easier to solve for that. So, okay, well, if I have to generate the results, then I have to understand the problem, or I have to understand the inner workings of this engine or this machine in order to generate those results. Is that kind of, have you seen that, or have you felt that, or seen that kind of around you over the years?
Yes. I look at it a certain way, and I do this even when I interview people for my team. They didn't make it through 3 rounds of interviews to finally have me without the skill sets being table stakes. That's assumed to be there.
Great point.
You would not be there if the skill set wasn't already built and there. What I try to parse out, and I try to role model, it's all the soft stuff that goes around that. The how do you think about problem solving? Are you going to be a good partner to the business because your mindset is open enough to kind of consider alternative solutions that might not have been your first thought, but could be someone else's? It's still a good thought. And so I kind of treat myself like that with the board, right? I wouldn't be in my role as the chief ethics and compliance officer for a Fortune 250 publicly traded company with 20,000 employees if my skill set wasn't already there.
Right.
It's how am I approaching issues? How am I willing to show a level of am I humble enough to tell them I don't know when I don't know and circle back and commit to circling back? And how am I fixing issues? I was at a conference last week and I was on a panel about board interactions. And one of the things that the panel was discussing was, if you go in and try to tell a board in a compliance role that everything at the company is perfect, you will lose credibility from the first thing you say to them. And I go in and I'm like, here's what's working well, here's what's not, but here's what we're working on to fix it. The first board meeting I ever had in my current role, I was like, here's the good news and here's the bad news. And they all started to laugh because I was like, I was 90 days into my job and they asked me to do a 90-day assessment. I did. But I think if you're not willing to own kind of what's not perfect, you lose credibility. And I think when you get to a point in your career where the table stakes are already a given, that you know the job, it's how you go about that job. And when you're willing to kind of be honest and say, this is what I've identified, this is what we're going to fix, this is what's working great. If I go in and just say everything's wonderful, nobody believes that. I wouldn't even be able to genuinely say that.
Well, then what do they need you for in some way?
Exactly. Exactly right.
But I mean, why do you think people end up kind of internalizing things that are wrong in the business as a reflection on them? I mean, I don't know, maybe that's a stupid question, but I mean, how can compliance be responsible for the compliance of the business? They can perhaps be responsible for identifying, systemic noncompliance, or they can perhaps be responsible for creating the circumstances for more compliant behavior. But it's almost like this sort of maybe this is it. Like it's kind of this like binary perfectionism sort of like dichotomy that a lot of folks view their programs as, that they end up sort of internalizing, that then prevent them from showing up in those board meetings as the type of partner or the type of teammate that the board is really relying on them to be.
I do think it goes to how you react when things go wrong. And I think if you have a program and you have a personality and a team of people that first and foremost view themselves as needing to be partners and help collectively problem solve, you're going to engender people who are willing to speak up, because they're not going to feel shamed when they've done something wrong. They're not going to feel afraid to bring a mistake forward. I mean, in a compliance and ethics role, your biggest source of information are your colleagues willing to come and ask you for your help to help them fix something that may not be perfect or something that inadvertently went sideways. But if you don't first and foremost react as a partner to say, no worries, how can I help you? Let's figure it out. They're not going to come and do that. And so that's part of what I look for in my team as well, is like, do I have the right personalities, right? You can have a lot of really smart people, but if they're going to be the act more like an enforcer rather than a solution partner, it's not going to work. And so to me, personality is just, if not more important than the skill set. I can teach somebody compliance. I can't necessarily teach them how to not overreact when a situation comes up. A company of any size is going to have issues. You have to be able to work through them in a calm way, in a how can we collectively help you way? What do we all need to do? Who do we need to bring on board to help us? We will fix this. We will do it together. And then what I always like to do, Nick, is I like to take a step back and say, how did we get there in the first place? Is there something my team needs to help with differently? Do we have a policy or procedures that may not be as effective as they need to be? And so I use everything as an ability to take lessons learned away. But the last thing I would ever want to do, and I would never expect my team to do, is make the people that actually may have caused the mistake feel less than. Because heck, we're all human. We all make mistakes, everybody in every role. And if you're not willing to kind of calmly address that and help people fix it, you're never going to get people willing to raise their hands. They're going to be afraid. They're going to have one bad experience and they're not going to come forward again because they don't want to deal with it. And in a corporate environment, that's like a death knell when you're in a compliance role. Like, you need people to trust you enough to bring issues forward so you can help them.
I always say that, compliance is a people business. It's not a legal business. It's a bunch of human beings. And there's all, to the extent that compliance exists to like add value or add enterprise value by de-risking the organization or like lowering the volatility of the operation, it's going to take that participation of all these stakeholders. And to your point, if we show up as an enforcer, it's going to kind of, people are going to feel like it's an electric fence. Like, how many times does a dog have to like pee on an electric fence? You know, it's like once. You know what I mean? Other than that, it's, you know, people are steering away from this this, you know, this shock or whatever, you know. I think it was interesting the way you kind of described that approach. You said, I want to show up as a, you know, a solution person. And then you sort of distinctly said, and then I want to look at how we got there. I have seen sort of that be flipped in some ways. And then, you know, when somebody comes to that issue, and I've probably been guilty of this, definitely guilty of this with my kids. When something goes wrong, it's like, well, why did this happen? That's the first answer, or that's the first question. And I think that's like wildly ineffective, because then sometimes you can't even get to that solution thing because you're starting to dig that moat around yourself. Talk to me a little bit about the order of those operations, you know?
I look at it this way, and to your point, I'm sure I've certainly been guilty of that with my own daughter. There's no doubt she would tell you that. But when it comes to the professional world, I look at it this way. What does it matter at that exact moment how it happened? It happened. So me digging in there first is not going to change the fact that I need to dig in and help the team solution and make it better and fix whatever went wrong. There's time to go back and say, okay, let's look at how did this happen? If it was, you know, is it a systemic issue? Was it a systems failure? Is it we have something programmed incorrectly? Like I'll have time for that. That's going to also kind of bubble up through just what we need to do to fix it, right? It kind of generally just starts to bubble to the top. When you go into solution mode, you can't solution if you don't know kind of how you got there, right? You don't even know where to start. And so I have found that just looking at how did we get here and starting with that as my first question is never constructive. Even with my own team, I'll circle back and be like, hey, was compliance in this? Like, did we even know this was going on? Did they bring? But that's to me a second round question. First round is what do we need to do to fix this? How can we help you? What do you need from us? Let's figure it out. And then second round is, okay, let's look back and say, is there something that needs to be fixed permanently? As it programs that we've helped set up that need to be addressed. So that to me if you don't do that as a second round, you lose your opportunity to learn from what went wrong. And so I'm always big on lessons learned. My team, I ask them all the time, what's the lesson learned here? What do we need to do differently, if anything? And not everything is going to give you these aha moments, but at least you've had the exercise of let's at least consider that. And so for me, I always think that's important. I just don't think starting with it is going to do anybody any good because you're dealing with something that's already happened. It's like, you know, past tense at that point.
Right. I mean, like if you see that your house is on fire, you start putting the fire out before you're like, what sparked the fire?
Yes,
or if you're on a trip and you like figure out that you're like on the wrong path, you're not pulling the car over. This is a pre Apple Maps analogy, but like you're not pulling the car over and looking at the map and saying, where did I get the wrong turn? You're saying like, how do I get back on track? And then you can look back. But it's so bizarre that in those, you know, those silly examples I just shared, the instinct is to like, all right, how do we get it back on track? How do we sort of put the fire out? And yet in sort of the corporate setting, I just see so consistently that first question being like, well, why did this happen? You know what I'm saying? It's crazy.
I've actually, I've worked with people in prior organizations where some people are just hardwired that way. And, you know, and I try to coach the best I can because that doesn't do them any good and it doesn't do my overall program any good. And then there are people where compliance and being solution oriented just isn't in their comfort zone. And so maybe they're just in the wrong role. And, you know, those people usually self-select out pretty quickly because, you know, if everybody around them is not, go to the blame game first or go to the enforcer mindset first, they're going to be the fish out of water. And so some companies have that culture. I've been fortunate to never work for one. And I intentionally seek that out. Like that would never work for me. I don't, I would not want to work for a company who thought of compliance that way and compliance acted that way. Like that just wouldn't fit me as a person professionally at all.
And you kind of was that like instinctive to like look for that in different opportunities?
Yes. I
And
ask
then
a
how
lot
do
of
you,
questions. I
yeah.
ask
And
questions.
so in those questions, you can kind of feel out, presumably kind of
Yes.
how this role is viewed, whether it's kind of
One
viewed
of the
as like
questions I
shackles.
always ask when I interview, so when I'll ask the people interviewing me how they engage with compliance. What does that partnership look like? And the answers are pretty telling, right?
Yeah.
The business people that are going to be true partners because they understand the value. And then the people that are like, well, I kind of only go to compliance when I absolutely have to. I appreciate their honesty, right? That kind of gives me a line of sight. And I do that even when I start a new role. Like, we're all on meet and greets for the first month we're there. You got to meet with this person, talk to this. And you start to kind of understand who are going to be your true business partners and who are the ones that probably are higher touch because you're going to have to bring them along to get them to think about you and your role differently. And you can't do that unless you kind of start showing up differently and they start to kind of believe that you can be a different
Right.
partner for them.
Yeah, I mean, compliance has the reputation it has, this sort of caricature that it has for some reason, right? I mean, people
Right.
have had these sort of negative experiences where there's this enforcer mentality or this like rigidity. And what you're kind of talking about is the antithesis of that, sort of a flexibility, solution mindset, seeking first to understand and, really, again, trying to be a partner to the business to add more value to the organization. When you encounter somebody that maybe you can tell kind of quickly that needs to be higher touch, as you said, how do you start to like change their mind and kind of end up bringing them along with you?
People that have worked with me, I joke, I'm like a bad penny. I just kind of keep showing up. I invite myself to meetings. I ask if I can be included. And I do that because it allows me a lens into how they like to operate. And if I can absorb that and then understand it and then fit in a way that works for them and then earn my stripes, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
adding risk-based solutioning at their table. I'm offering up guidance. I went into a new role at a prior organization, and the business leader, again, I've had tidbits of this amazing gift of feedback and advice over my career. And he said to me, Noreen, I want you at my table. But when you're at my table, you're not just there in your compliance role. You're there as a member of my senior leadership team. So
Right.
if you're seeing something, hearing something, and you have an opinion, I expect you to add value by sharing that
Right.
opinion. Um, and it was such an empowering ask. It was like, you're not just there. And so when you're there and you're just a senior business leader, yeah, my role is compliance, but I've been in financial services for 40 years at this point. Like it's a long time, and so I've seen a lot in my career journey. I've lived through a lot of different phases of the financial services industry, ups, downs, good, bad. And I have an opinion, I share it, and I think, and I ask questions, and I'm like, walk me through this. Like, have we thought about this? And I think when you do that, you start to kind of just foster a different relationship that wants it allows them to want you at their table. They recognize you're not going to be the no person, you're not a disruptor.
Right.
You're there to just add value. And so I just kind of feel like that has to be earned. You can't just demand that, and you don't earn that until you start to really share a different operating model. You start to kind of demonstrate behavior that may be surprising but welcome to them.
Yeah. And, yes, fine. It might need to be earned, but also we all have agency to create the circumstances to show that we're earning it.
Yes.
Like you talked, you're like a bad penny. You're showing up in these meetings. That's a much different approach than saying like, staying in my office and waiting till I'm invited to things. You're kind of pushing yourself into those conversations, and that's creating a lot more touch points, a lot more data points for that person, who might need a little bit more attention or you need to be a little bit higher touch with to kind of bring them along. And that, I think that's how you can convince somebody. Like people need, if they've had a bad experience with a certain type of person or a certain person in this role, you have to create those circumstances for success. and give them more touch points and give them more data to kind of change their mind. But I love what you said about, that advice you got from that other leader. I think so many of us in this space and in this role, we're like scared to do that. I kind of firmly believe that we all sort of like form these cages, or like we build these prisons in our own mind, and like we control where those walls are. And I think if we carve a moat around ourselves and say, okay, well, I can only speak on compliance things, as opposed to saying, well, like, I'm on the team, we're all wearing the same jersey, I'm in this role for a reason, and my voice matters and my perspective matters. It really helps us to not only, I think it helps us to kind of push those walls out a lot, but it also helps to, again, kind of create those circumstances for showing that we're trying to add value, and makes it easier then to connect our efforts to, the objectives of the business. You know what I'm saying?
It's very true.
It kind of like takes our blinders off in some ways,
It does. And I think, listen, there are things that I'm not out there trying to have an opinion on, things that I really don't understand a lot about. But the reality of it is I have enough business sense and business experience to have some thoughts, and where it's appropriate, I share them, and people appreciate that.
So I have a couple more questions. I can't believe we're at time almost here. I really wanted to hear how you can better, like, what strategies you have in, living in the gray. I mean, we spent a lot of time in our pre-call kind of talking about that, and how kind of getting a better understanding of like what the risk appetite of the business is can help you as an ethics and compliance officer, and your team, and then sort of concentrically out the rest of the organization navigate through that gray.
I appreciate the question, Nick, because I think honestly that's where most of us live today in our roles, right? Yeah. I think when you're in a highly regulated industry like financial services, you're not working in an environment. Hopefully, I've been blessed to never be in this environment where the company just breaks laws and regulations. That's not the case, right? So I've always viewed it like there's red rules, there's green rules. If there's a red rule, we're not even talking about it. We're not doing it, right? That's not even open for discussion. But when most of the decisions are not that. They're, okay, we're trying something new. We want to look at something new. And so living in the gray to me is really being comfortable existing where clear-cut answers don't exist. And, not everybody is comfortable with that, but a good compliance professional needs to be, because part of it is you have to gain a deeper understanding of what is the risk appetite for the business. It kind of goes back to my earlier point. You don't know that unless you're asking, right? You need to ask, what is the risk appetite? And then the value add for compliance is overlaying that with a multitude of lenses. What does the external environment look like around this? What is the regulatory informal appetite around this? Is it likely to change anytime soon? What are your peer companies doing? Do you have enough of a network to reach out and say, hey, competitor, peer company, like, how are you handling this kind of amorphous compliance issue? And, what direction is your business taking? And so having all of that ability and overlaying that and giving the business options is really where you add the value. And the best compliance professional lays out those options for their business partners, so their business partners can make fully informed risk-based decisions. And, that means talking to them about all the variations of risk. Is the risk, okay, it's this today, but hey, we're hearing regulators are starting to go in this direction, which means next year we could have to quickly pivot. Are you okay with that? Every business partner I've ever laid out options to appreciates being educated on that. I mean, ultimately they have to make that call. My job is to make sure they're making it fully informed with every lens I can bring to bear for them. And that requires me to keep abreast of what's happening outside of my organization in order to kind of, factor that into the conversation. But I don't think in today's environment, first of all, you have so many things changing pretty regularly,
right?
That you can just assume you're not going to have to exist outside of living in the gray. That's just part of every day, I think, for most compliance professionals.
Yeah, I mean, there's like no black and white. There's no like formula to do compliance. There's no
Right.
formula to build a great business. I mean, there's, concepts, there's principles and stuff like
Sure.
that, but it's just really a collection of all these like marginal decisions that are made, and hopefully over time, more of them are good decisions than bad decisions.
It's correct. It's correct.
All right, last question, I promise. Okay.
Okay.
If you had one piece of advice, I mean, this has been a phenomenal episode. I feel like so invigorated. There's so much I'm going to steal from you for this conversation. But if you had one piece of advice that either you wish you had when you were younger, or one piece of advice that you could tell all the compliance people listening, what would that piece of advice be?
That's a great question. It's kind of a hard question because I don't know that I have one, but I would say that the thing that's resonated with me the most, and I think has helped me the most, is you have to just be open to the conversation. And I think when you're willing to kind of understand you have a role to play, but you don't take that so seriously that it makes you less open to dialogue and other perspectives on how to go about something, you do yourself a disservice to add to your own toolkit of knowledge and how you can go about an issue. And I think sometimes compliance professionals feel like there might only be one way to get to the objective. And
Right.
the best advice I can give is there's probably 16 different ways. And as a good compliance professional will consider all 16 of them and not always pick theirs. And I've learned so much in my career journey from listening to other options from people that do jobs outside of compliance that may have a different perspective. And the best advice I can give is just be open to that. Yes, ultimately, you may have to make a hard call, and maybe it doesn't take into account any of those other 15 options, but you've learned more and you've earned credibility by just listening to them and giving them serious consideration.
Yeah, and you increase the odds that what you land on is going to be the most optimized.
That's right. Absolutely.
Love it. Noreen, thank you so much for coming on the Ethics Experts. We will see you next time. This was really
Thanks,
great.
Nick. This has been wonderful. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.